So we're live. Welcome everybody to this online conference. We wished it was in our premises at the AUBG's Blagoevgrad campus. Unfortunately, we have to reinvent the way we communicate and innovate in a sense. When it comes to organizing such events. So it is online, as you all can see, and of course it is streamed on AUBG's Facebook page. This is not the first time, this is the fourth time that the American University in Bulgaria is hosting the Bulgarian leg of the Free Market Roadshow. And we want to thank wholeheartedly the Austrian Economic Center and the Free Market Roadshow organization for trusting us with this opportunity to have them coming back and back again year after year on our campus, this time virtually, of course. And the pleasure is even greater because we have returning participants, returning panelists, Federico Fernández and John Chisholm, who will join us a bit later from California. And this topic that we have today is all related to the response that free market forces, namely entrepreneurs, innovators, could provide in the current situation of a global pandemic, something we haven't experienced with this level of intensity and I would say even brutality. So before we continue, I would also like to thank the Dean of Faculty, Robert White, for all the efforts he has done to make this event happen. And our just fresh alumnus, Luka Gotsiridze, who is still on campus in Blagoevgrad and supports this event and makes it technically possible. So thank you, both of you, and welcome everybody who is currently jumping online to this panel on disruptive innovation. We'll have to define, of course, this very specific term of disruptive innovation and define how it would flourish or how it, on the contrary, be hindered by the current situation we're in. So we'll start our discussion with Federico Fernández. I have already presented, and I'll have a short words to present them furthermore to you, and of course Razi Ginzberg, who joins us from London. He is the director of the Ayn Rand Center in London, UK, and he's for 2 or 3 years now very active in promoting the ideas of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism in London, in Cambridge, through speeches and through seminars. The pleasure of reintroducing Federico Fernández to the audience is absolutely genuine. He was with us last year when we hosted the Free Market Roadshow in Blagoevgrad. We spoke about Europe that time, Europe at Crossroads. Federico is a scholar and an author and an editor, and of course a free market activist. And among the broad variety of his occupations, it's a long list, believe me. He's executive director of Somos Innovación, that's a Latin American Pro-Innovation Alliance. He's a senior fellow with the Austrian Economic Center organizing this event. He's also the founder and president of the Fundación Internacional in Rosario, Argentina. Not only does he do all these things, he's also the chairman of the organizing committee for this year's International Conference on the Austrian School of Economics in the 21st Century. It shall take place in Vienna. We all are looking forward for this event, and we hope that it will be held as planned. He has written for different outlets like The Economist, El País, Newsweek, La Nación, among others. And he's co-editing books like An Austrian in Argentina. Those would be essays in honor of Alberto Venegas Lynch, and La Escuela Austriaca de Economía en el siglo XXI, all of those published in Argentina. So this current situation we're in, of course, is unusual, and it has taken a toll on all of us. It has constituted a supply shock, something we did not expect and we were not prepared to, despite the facts that ever since, let's say, late 2018, early 2019, some voices started to emerge warning about a possible economic downturn due to either overheating economy or asset bubbles. So there were a number of indicators showing us that we may be heading for some serious economic troubles before this absolutely unexpected black swan event happened, and basically put us down to our knees. We all have heard the projections and the forecasts for an economy downturn and a contraction of almost 10% of GDP from various developed countries and economies. And that, of course, was the question, will we be able to ever go back to normal, as everybody's looking forward to go back to normal, the way we used to live our lives, thinking that what normal is may be, as a matter of fact, subject of discussion. So disruptive innovation is just not a simple let's say economic concept which has emerged in the late 90s in economic studies of business strategic behavior. Disruptive innovation is not that much of a technical based innovation, rather than an innovation which is related to the way we organize our production processes and the way we distribute, we manage and we distribute through our value chains and our supply chains the produce of those efforts. So the question is, were we good enough before that crisis, and shall we really be looking forward to returning back to normal, or shall we use this current crisis to question and possibly reinvent the way we do business, we generate value and wealth, and we distribute it throughout, of course, customers and clients? Shall we be looking forward to return back to normal? Federico, I would love to have your opinion on what normal would be, and shall we really be looking forward for that?
Hello, Momtchil. Thank you very much for the very interesting welcoming remarks. Thanks, Razi, for being here, the same as John. Thanks, Robert, and everyone at the university. We're always very happy to cooperate. It's a pity really not being able to be there physically, but well, hopefully, you know, better times will come. In the meantime, at least we have these magnificent tools that allow us to still be in contact and to still be producing the kind of events that we want to do. Regarding your question, it's a great question, you know, and I won't have the definitive answer for it. What I would say, and I was taking some notes as you were speaking, I really like the part of, you know, going back to normal and you know what normal was or used to be. And I would say that it's a two-part question. On the one hand, I am really looking forward to going back to normal, in the sense, you know, of being able to travel, of being able to see whoever I want to see, to be able to be on the streets without being harassed by the police, or things like that are happening, you know, all around the globe. I come from South America, and there, of course, particularly in my country, in Argentina, these things are a little bit out of control, in the sense that the government has taken a very fascistic turn. So there are very, very bad things happening, and we definitely should go back to normal as soon as we can. And I am a strong supporter of everything, you know, that is being done now as webinars, live events on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. But the very moment we can recover the face-to-face communication, we can recover the capacity to go out and have a coffee with a friend, we have to do it. We must do it. But on the other hand, the going back to normal, and sorry, maybe this is not that related to innovation, but I think it's important to be said. The problem is, you know, if this crisis is going to be dealt as all the crises that we've been having, at least throughout the 21st century. And if going back to normal means what it seems it's meaning currently, which is printing money like crazy and government spending to kick the can down the road and try to avoid the crisis while they are inflating an even bigger one, that's not the normality I would like to come back. This crisis has shown how, let's say, naked the king really is, because I know this crisis is a huge shock, but on the other hand, it has shown that, you know, of course, states, municipalities, provinces, but families or even companies cannot sustain themselves for a couple of weeks without a government handout. That's really serious and extremely sad, by the way. How can you be an adult if you cannot provide for your family for a couple of weeks, you know, in a moment of distress? I mean, because this is really, compared to the crisis that Europe has seen in the past, this is not like the worst thing that has ever happened. And finally, because I don't want to take that much of your time, something that we all should keep in mind is the following. Like you said, there were lots of threats and warnings in the horizon before coronavirus. And coronavirus may very well operate as the needle that pops the bubble that we've been pumping very much since 2008 with a very crazy monetary policy. And that is something, unfortunately, we have to take into consideration, and we have to think, what are the responses that should come up if this crisis really unravels as a very big one, as a very bad one and big one?
Thank you, Federico. So basically you're saying that neither is it desirable nor is it a possible option. And if it is so, then I would love to hear from Razi and use his imagination or rely on his capacity to imagine a world, a post-pandemic world, and what not only the economy, but the underlying philosophy of our economic and social processes shall be, and on what, if possible, sound foundations may we use this crisis as a pedestal for further growth and progress, and of course improvement of our condition.
Yeah. Thanks, Momtchil, and thanks to the American University in Bulgaria and to the Austrian Economic Center for putting on these events. I know they were meant to be live or in person, and it's very good that we're still doing them even though we can't be there in person. This is actually my first time as a panelist, but I've been an attendee in the past, including last year in Blagoevgrad, and I think what we need a lot of and a lot more of is that kind of stuff, what the Austrian Economic Center does, what AUBG and Robert do. And this is a very important time to do that, because in the field of ideas, there is sort of a vacuum being created because I think there's an opportunity for us to step in, for those of us who support individual liberty and responsibility, in part by pointing out the colossal failure that is the idea that government is the solution to every problem, rather than in some cases like now, taking a serious problem and creating a much bigger one from it, supposedly as a solution. Actually, Federico, to what you said about people now kind of being unable to sustain themselves without a government handout, that's a problem. But it's also businesses. I understand businesses that take money from the government now. The government comes in and says you're not allowed to run your business, and best of luck. So businesses are basically they are being destroyed by government policy, and their only way to sort of ride this out in some cases is to take that government handout. So I think maybe certainly in some cases they should do that, but they should also know that in the long run, what matters is, and what shapes the way that government acts is ideas, and not just ideas about politics, about the role of the state, but fundamentally ideas about human nature and the role of the mind in an individual's life. And are we able to make decisions for ourselves? Can I look at the information when there is a virus out there and a global pandemic? Can I look at that information and make a decision for myself that might not be might not fit in the one size fits all solution that government offers, but might work for me, and somebody else, certainly should not do the same thing. It is contextual. If you have in this case, if it's very unlikely that you will die from the virus, you should not be as afraid to go out as somebody who is at risk. And that's just one field. So I think we should use this opportunity, and make no mistake about it. Like we in the liberty movement, pro free market people, look at this and see how government has expanded over a short period of time to an extent that we've never seen before. Make no mistake about it. This is not the anti-freedom side is not looking at this and saying, all right, we've won. We don't need to do anything else. They are ready, and they're already out there. One of the reasons that are given for why government should intervene more in the economy is global warming, or climate change as it's called now. And that's being pushed now as well. Certain restrictions on individual liberty that were supposed to take place over years or decades. Now environmentalists are out there saying, why not make the new normal a green normal? And of course, that green normal will come at the expense of the energy that we use, and will keep us down to where we've been for the past few months. And I think we should really step up our efforts now more than ever to fight for freedom.
Thank you, Razi. Took me a while to find how to unmute myself, of course. I like your approach to the fact that the government is expanding, and is expanding at a very, very quick pace across many so-called well-established democracies. But if I may disagree with you on one tiny little point, we have seen, especially here in my area of Eastern Europe and elsewhere too, governments being very, so to speak, omnipresent in each and every, or almost every aspect of individual life. And I would love to hear from both of you what your reaction is to those very often well presented and argumented opportunities or possibilities for monitoring the masses of people through those new applications, relying on new technologies, mobile phones, etc. And those new applications were tracking people who are at risk. You, Razi, mentioned the fact that, well, we need to, in a way, discriminate among those who are not at risk and those who are at risk, which of course raises a moral question of who will be enforcing this discrimination, but also the use of those technologies. And we know that in China, such technologies have been already widely used and relied upon by the government in order to protect the population from the virus. And of course, with the question which follows is what will happen with all those, with all the data collected by the government when it comes to monitoring everybody's everyday life. So this is an example of an innovation. It is not disruptive in a sense, in a technological sense, because the technology exists. However, I understand it's a disruptive, as it will disrupt our social interactions and I would say condition the way we behave with each other, and of course we behave with the government. What your take on this is?
That's for me, right? Yeah. So yeah, the thought of government knowing where I am at every moment and knowing where every citizen is, it makes my skin crawl. That being said, so you were asking about who will decide, how great a risk is to each individual, and I think that obviously has to be that individual themselves. But if you are a risk to others, that's when I do think government should step in, because if you had the virus, there were stories here in London. There was one story about somebody spitting in two women's faces and saying that he has coronavirus, and one of them died. So certainly somebody who is a risk to others, government, that is what government is for. And I'm not an anarchist. I support the existence of government. I think it's a necessary good. Unfortunately, it does a lot of unnecessary evil. But in an ideal situation, yes, we would have government just protecting those who are not a risk to others from those who are.
Yeah, thank you, Federico. Would you agree? I mean, this is we depend on well, not only we depend, but we ask the government to depend on its action, on its proactive, so to speak, position instead of reactive position. Once individual responsibility has taken place, now we rely on the government to prevent things from happening based on the usage of such a technology. What your reaction to that is?
I think it's a very interesting question. The technology issue, I think that with the coronavirus, we are seeing exactly how important innovation is. And also we can see, as usual, I mean, this is not new. This is more or less, I mean, when someone invented something similar to the hammer, you can use the hammer either for a nail or to break someone's head. Technology has always had, this, double-edged sword, thing, let's say. I think privacy is extremely important for freedom and, for being able to live as individuals. And that should be at the top of the priorities whenever, let's say, we use any technology. I don't want the government spying on my Facebook or my Twitter, let's say. I wouldn't like it to hack to my phone and then see what I message with whom. But on the other hand, we are also seeing how powerful technology is to help us solve these issues. In part, Razi made a very interesting point when he mentioned earlier the issue with so-called climate change. And the thing that unifies, I mean, there are several things that unify the corona crisis and climate change, but one of them, and one at the very base of both, is the totally insane use of models and modelization in order to make, I mean, take models as if they were reality and then make predictions upon that reality. That has led us to terrible consequences. Well, and in fact, the main author of the model that the British used was recently caught violating the quarantine. And I'm not going to say due to, you know, good taste, in which circumstances he was found. You just can Google him and find out on yourself. They were quite disgusting, let's say. And in any case, the main point I would like to make is the following. I think technology is an amazing force for good, but I am not a supporter of some sort of technological redemption. Let's take a technology like blockchain. Blockchain is magnificent, but as you mentioned, the moment China, you know, combines somehow blockchain technology and facial recognition, the Chinese people would be the most enslaved people in the world and probably in human history. This is because technology also needs, let's say, an environment in which it grows, a cultural, more, you know, over everything else, and then political and social conditions in order not to become a totalitarian project. And this is something I think in all our societies we are going to have to face, and this is going to be a very important discussion in the coming years.
Thank you. Yeah, Razi, do you have a reaction? You seem to be willing to.
First of all, I completely agree with Federico that there are many similarities, and this is a very important one, that they're both based on models, computer models, and the thing is, both are based on models that have been consistently failing every single time, pretty much. And one of the things that you know, I think you're being too generous to Neil Ferguson. You know, some people deserve your generosity. He is not one of them. And I think the fact that he pushed for government to in the UK and in other countries to lock us all down, and then didn't follow the rules that he himself helped impose on us, says a lot about, you know, and you see that in climate activism as well. You know, people drive in their cars to a protest, or even take the bus to a protest, demanding that we all stop using fossil fuels. So, and this actually goes back to my point about the field of ideas, because it tells you something about people when they advocate for certain ideas that they themselves choose not to practice. It means that they, at some level, recognize that these ideas are impracticable. And since these ideas involve restrictions on all our lives, we should be calling them out on that, and as often as possible, and pointing out the hypocrisy.
Yeah, indeed. I like your focus on the field of ideas, and I would love to be a little bit provocative here, because when we speak about what is to be done and what is to be kept as it used to be, that is to preserve, even in the face of this crisis and the pandemic and the impact it had on all our supply chains and value chains, what we call the technological support networks for our industries. One outlier clearly stands out, not only because a developed economy with well-established democratic procedures decided to do so, but also because it is traditionally, let's say, more of a lighthouse for welfare state, and that would be Sweden. What your reaction to the Swedish example in this situation is, especially when it comes to ideas about what changes and what is to be kept despite the efforts and despite the possible sacrifices and losses in terms of course, humans, human lives, but also in terms of arrangements within society, understand social links, economic interactions, even political interdependence. For any of you. I mean,
well, I actually don't have that much to say about it because I haven't looked into the reasoning behind Sweden not going into the UK style lockdown. I doubt it's because they're suddenly, you know, realizing because of COVID-19 that actually, you know, government should step out of the way of people's lives. And I kept hearing this joke being repeated that the Swedes were practicing social distancing before, so you know maybe it's not that much of an issue for them. Yeah, that I don't have much to elaborate on that. I'm not that optimistic that you know that this says a lot about Sweden being a beacon of light for the rest of us.
I'll go with a little bit more of optimism than Razi. I think what I mean. Firstly, there are many interesting things with the Swedish example. Firstly, is that Sweden is not a socialist country. Sweden was one of the most capitalist countries in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Then, unfortunately, they took a wrong turn. Let's say they tried to become a literal socialist country, and of course, as it happens everywhere, Bulgaria, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, or wherever, when you apply socialism, you go bankrupt. And they were this close to go bankrupt by the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and they had to change. And they changed a lot. It's still a very highly taxed economy, definitely, but it's also an economy that is quite open in order to start a company and many things. So it's not a pure capitalist example, definitely not, but it's not also, you know, Cuba with blonde people, let's say. It's completely different. The second thing, it's very interesting also how Sweden was, let's say, demonized by the same people who used to take it as their best example and the best role model ever, because the government decided not to enslave their own population with these forced quarantines. And that is also a very interesting development, because, and I think everybody knows this, you know, and particularly in Latin America, Sweden was always like this, you know, the white knight of socialism. You know, we should be like Sweden because they do everything great and they live happy, you know, happily ever after. The third thing, and this is also very sad, unfortunately, and now I rejoin again Razi with the not so optimistic. Sweden should not be the exception, it should be the rule. This experiment that, you know, many of us are going through right now is something that literally has never happened throughout history. You've never put healthy people in quarantine. You've never put the whole of society in quarantine. No one ever has stopped the economy, the full economy. And I'm not saying we shouldn't care about people who could. No, I'm not saying. It's not that people didn't care in the past, but they tried to deal with this in different ways. And what's very important, because now some time has passed, when we see the development of the famous curve, you know, the curve that we had to flatten, the development of the Swedish curve is very similar, almost the same kind of curve as basically any other country in the world. And this really shows us that the forced quarantines, the lockdowns, the collapse of the economy, and this very expensive joke that we are living through was not necessary and probably was a hysterical reaction.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to bounce out on of this understanding that you have of such a hysteric reaction to reality without really knowing what's going on. And I'll again be a little bit provocative, taking on from Marx, who allegedly used to say that we cannot manage that which we cannot measure, if I remember correctly. But here is something else I want to really focus on, because innovation is supposed to be, and it has been, and we hope it will be, the main source of progress. When we come up with our economic models, and those are a bit perhaps more complex than the epidemiological models we have used over the last couple of months. When we come with our economic models, forecasting or predicting growth, then the technological change there, which we will speak further in details as soon as John joins us, is precisely the driving force behind progress and improvement and growth, of course. What we're talking about right now, and what we're focusing on, is the role and the place of the state when it comes to creating the conditions, if ever the state is to be creating those conditions for a thriving, innovative industries, startup businesses, etc. And with what we observe, and not only for the last couple of months, but rather more long-term tendency, which we may see emerging after the 2008 crisis, is a worrisome tendency of many industrialists, entrepreneurs, business people to turn to the state for support. And this is not only the case in Bulgaria, this is, I understand, the case all across the globe. And with all of those very generous promises by governments of hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars to be injected in the economy, don't you think that we're actually killing all innovation, motivational desire by entrepreneurs and by innovators to change the world, to provide a new market or a new product or a new process or service, rather than looking for and seeking for the short-term gain as they turn and direct resources towards government subsidies and government-sponsored contracts. Isn't it a little bit an illustration of a return to towards the closed society in Popperian terms? And where this road will eventually lead us to? I admit that my understanding and my reading is quite pessimistic, and perhaps it is due to the point where I stand here in Eastern Europe, where things are, at least in that respect, quite gloomy. Perhaps elsewhere, perhaps it's different.
No, I think you struck a very important chord that we should. It's very important what you mentioned. There have been lots of calls recently, let's say, of state-driven innovation or things like that. That I don't think that's the best idea to go, and I'll explain quickly why. I think, firstly, I mean, I think Peter Thiel said this. You know, we were promised flying cars, and we got Twitter, and that's really, I mean, and Twitter is fantastic in many ways. I use it every day. I have it on my phone. It's not a criticism to Twitter itself, but innovation has been stopped, let's say, in the world of atoms, and it's way easier to innovate in the world of bits. Why? Because of regulation, and regulation comes from the government. And the other major issue is that when you innovate, and innovation, we have to, let's say, we shouldn't not romanticize innovation. Innovation is not just, it's not having a magnificent idea that, you know, nobody, it's just sometimes, you know, connecting things in a different way, or just like Matt Ridley says, John also has great examples about this, but I want him to tell them and not tell them myself. But as Matt Ridley says, innovation is way more connected to perspiration than inspiration. But the issue is that those people who are trying to create new things should not have a boot that stops them from doing it. What we should really advocate for is the presumption of innocence for innovation. Today, one of the biggest problems that we suffer everywhere is that innovation is born with an original sin, and it has that sin has to be, and please, I'm not saying this against religion, but that sin, I'm just using it as an analogy, that sin has to be erased by the authorities of the state, and that's a very big problem. Or you have to convince your competitors that you can innovate, which really makes no sense. You know, if you want to, you know, I don't know, put a service similar to Uber in one city and you have to talk to the taxi cartel, it's complicated. So that I think it's the conversation we have to have. And there's another writer, an author who has a very interesting, let's say, a very simple formula. Let's suppose we were making a cocktail. It should always be 9 parts of innovation and just 1 part of regulation. If that cocktail, if the proportions revert, it would become an explosive cocktail, a Molotov cocktail probably, and we don't want that. So really, the key issue is to free innovation, to liberate them from the burdens of regulation, and to give regulation back the presumption of innocence.
Yeah, I agree with that. And yeah, the state creates the conditions for innovation, so to speak, by getting out of the way. That is the only way the state can aid innovation. And what created the conditions for innovation is nature. It's the fact that as humans, our means of survival is our mind. We have it already. The state can then point a gun at us and say, you're not allowed to use that. So once that gun is removed from the equation, that is how the state would allow, so to speak, individuals to innovate. Now, why people who do innovate, why they go to why they end up doing things like Twitter or Instagram, I also think they have Twitter and Instagram have their place, but the reason that's happening, and flying cars or not, and also the reason we're getting electric cars instead of flying cars is, again, and I know I've repeated this point a few times, but it is the ideas underlying the culture. There was Andrew Breitbart who said that politics is downstream from culture, and Ayn Rand herself also said that fundamental philosophical principles are the basis for all of that. So I think that is where we should aim our focus, and we should also at least see some optimism in the way that people who are advocating the current policies by government and worse policies, the way they try to defend it, which is, they don't have a strong defense of it. And any criticism nowadays, you criticize the lockdown, people will immediately say, are you a scientist? And by the way, one thing I've noticed is none of the people who say, are you a scientist, are scientists themselves, but they choose, they're scientists. The scientists that they choose to follow, they're the right ones because they're the government scientists. So they have no strong ideas that can withhold a challenge. We just need to be there as challengers.
Thank you, Razi. John is with us, and I'm delighted that you made it. Hello, John.
Hello.
For those of you who have not been with us last year at the Free Market Roadshow in Blagoevgrad in 2019, John was our guest along with Federico, and boy, is it a long bio that I have to go through to present him, but he joins us at the right spot in our discussion as an entrepreneur and an investor, not only as a thinker and a columnist or author. He has this absolutely amazing track of entrepreneur activities in technological industries. MIT and Harvard Business School graduate, incredible experience as a CEO of Decisive Technology, which is now part of Google, of CustomerSat, now which part of Confirmit, a very active promoter of free market ideas and individual liberties. He was talking about what should and what should not the Bulgarian government do last year to promote entrepreneur activities and innovative activities. So, John, thank you for joining us. And I would love to, on the basis of our discussion so far, discussion of what ideas shall be fueling innovation, turn to you with a bit more technical questions based on your experience. Were we technologically prepared, even without knowing, obviously, that such a pandemic was coming? Were we technologically prepared to sustain the hit, both from a, let's say, everyday business perspective, but also from the point of view of appropriately allocating resources where they're needed in coping and responding to this pandemic? Basically, did we have the resources to be innovative in the face of the pandemic?
Okay, well, that's a lot. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, Chief, thank you so much for that introduction. I have such fond memories of being at the American University in Bulgaria last year on the Austrian Economic Center's Free Market Roadshow, and I'm so sorry we're not there in person this year, and I'm hoping we can get back next year. Were we prepared for the pandemic? Well, I think obviously the answer is no. And often I hear it said it'll take 5 years to develop and launch and make widely available a vaccine. Well, how sad that we didn't have this conversation 5 years ago. Because if we had, maybe we'd have the vaccine today. In my experience, starting a business, doing innovation is generally easier today along most dimensions than it was 25 years ago when I started my first company. It's easier to find components that'll make up your offering. It's easier to find investors and team members who are equally passionate and knowledgeable about what you are and about whatever your and whose skills are complementary to yours. You can train yourself online free of charge by taking online courses. You can outsource functions that aren't strategic so that you can focus on what you do most strategically. The one way that starting a business and innovating has become harder over the last 25 years, in my experience, is regulatory compliance. And this is a perfect example. In the United States, we've seen that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has been the biggest obstacle to any number of ways that we could help the panacea get out to people, either testing or PPE, personally protective equipment, because it didn't precisely meet federal standards. One of the PPE, one of the testing regulations requires that a physician be present and disallowing people from doing the testing for the coronavirus in the privacy of their own home, which would obviously be much more scalable. in the US at least, a number of regulations have been temporarily relaxed thanks to the coronavirus with no negative consequences. Let me give you 3 examples. Number one, the use of scooters in cities. Since people can't take Uber, don't want to, or want to social distance, riding a scooter, a motorized scooter is a good way to get around. Those are now allowed in many places where they weren't previously. Before, many restaurants had to have a special permit to have takeaway. Now they don't have to have that. No negative consequences there. Doctors had been precluded in many jurisdictions from doing telemedicine. Those have been relaxed. No negative consequences there. These are regulations that should never have been placed in the first place. And it's in my view, the relaxing of such regulations is the lowest hanging fruit for us to get back to business after the pandemic. And I think it's incumbent upon each and every one of us who is an entrepreneur, who aspires to be an entrepreneur, or who enjoys the fruits of entrepreneurship, and that's all of us, to speak out against these regulations that are keeping entrepreneurs from satisfying human and customer needs during this time. So those are a few thoughts, Momtchil.
Yeah, thank you. So, isn't it a little bit ironic that all of those regulations in the US, but not only in Europe, believe me, we have plenty of those, and elsewhere, of course, they contribute by, of course, being relaxed to providing a not necessarily the most adequate response to the crisis, but at least allowing for businesses to not continue as they used to, but to find those new ways of organizing their production process, touching to their customers in order to see how best they can respond to their expectations and needs and desires, of course, and that it is one gigantic pool of opportunities, as you say, that we have in improving our business environment despite the pandemic by not necessarily little by little scrapping all of those regulations. And my question was, could we imagine the post-pandemic economy, both in terms of industries, in terms of technologies, but also, as many of our viewers and the audience would be interested in terms of personal skills which will be adequate for this post-pandemic economy? What new will emerge? And of course, the question goes for all 3 of you. What will be the post-pandemic economic world?
Well, there are a huge number of new opportunities that have opened up for entrepreneurs as a result of the pandemic. And I understand that a fair number of folks in the audience are either entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs. Great, this is a good time. Especially if your company or business that you're contemplating, or if you're just contemplating a new business, we don't have the normal day-to-day interruptions. We can focus more 100% on whatever it is we're trying to create to understand the needs. This is a good time to start a business. Think of your own personal needs, how they have changed. Probably you can't go to the gym. You can't go to your favorite restaurant. You can't see your doctor in person. You need a way to get food delivery. We can't go to sporting events like we'd like to. We can't see our friends and loved ones. All of those are new, unsatisfied human and customer needs. And new needs mean new opportunities. If you already have some other business in mind that you've been planning for some time, it will probably evolve and need to evolve as a result of the pandemic. Maybe you can gain an advantage by being early to do that. I like to say that there are only two things you need to start a business and make it a success: a real unsatisfied customer need and an advantage for satisfying that needs relative to others who might try to satisfy it. Now, there are tons of unsatisfied customer needs out there, and each and every one of us have tons of advantages, but they're like puzzle pieces and they have to fit together. And the key question is finding the need and your advantages that fit together the best. If you do this in an area that you're passionate about and perseverant about, you will have natural advantages there, because you will be first to bump up against unsatisfied customer needs in those areas, since you're trying all the different products and services that are in those areas. So think about what new needs haven't been addressed that you can satisfy. And then focusing on the other puzzle piece, your advantages, your advantage may be very small. Think of the lady who cleans your house. If there's only one lady that you're willing to have clean your house, she has an advantage, doesn't she? You trust her, you know her. Similarly, you may have such an advantage with some group of potential customers. So the advantage doesn't have to be something huge and strategic. Remember that even McDonald's, the largest hamburger chain in the world, started from a single little shop. So you have to start small. One of the things that we have to calculate, and this is a tough calculation, is which needs are short-lived and which ones will continue indefinitely after the pandemic. And you just have to make your best judgment call. Talk to people, ask people, look at yourself. Do you see things going back or not going back? What are the enemies to starting your own business during this time? Well, they're both internal and external enemies. The internal enemies are like Netflix, YouTube, television, things that distract you from focusing on getting your new enterprise underway. I'm blessed. I don't have a TV. And I've never used Netflix, believe it or not, my entire life. So don't be distracted by those. The other enemies are external. Those are the regulatory enemies that we talked about. And had some of them been relaxed earlier rather than now as a result of the pandemic, maybe we'd have the vaccine now. So those are a few thoughts, Momtchil.
Yeah, thank you. There are already questions coming in, and they are indeed very much related to our understanding of what disruptive stands for in innovation. So I will myself venture to answer at least in part of the questions. One of them is related to what the difference between disruptive technological innovation and disruptive business model innovation would be, from one of our students. Eva here, I would say that there is no difference. John perhaps may argue with that, but innovation itself and the disruptiveness of innovation here is not necessarily the technological change, but rather the rearrangement of existing, so to speak, off-the-shelf technologies which we have available, but we haven't figured out yet until now how to use in an optimal or a better way, so that we're capable of extracting further value and wealth from this rearrangement of our production processes, be it service or good production-oriented activities, or of course distribution. And the other one, however, is still related to our understanding of what the role of innovation is and how is it supposed to change, improve the world, prevent such shocks in the future. And the question is an innovation disruptive if it can prevent, that is, forecast such a shock as the pandemic that we're currently in? Or, put it differently, would it be actually a non-disruptive innovation if it can answer such forthcoming risks that we may need to cope with? All three of you, whoever has the quickest idea, the quickest reaction to that disruptiveness of innovation.
I'll go first very quickly, Momtchil. About the first question, I think, and I mean, John probably has a better idea about this than me, but in many cases, let's say disruptive business models, say, are mounted on top of disruptive innovation, or disruptive technology, or at least new technology that, things that didn't appear. And the first example that comes to mind is the case of Uber that I mentioned earlier. The best account of how Uber was created, as far as I know, is told in a book called The Upstarts by Brad Stone. I recommend everyone to read that book. It's a magnificent book. And it tells, firstly, the metaphysical origins of Uber, which come from a gentleman, one of the founders, named Garrett Camp, who saw a James Bond movie. Must have been a very old James Bond movie in which he controls his car with a cell phone and also sees where the car is on a map. And he said this would be a great idea in order to call a taxi. In that way, those days there were only taxis. When we finally had that technology here in our cell phones with GPS, when phones had maps and GPS, that could be turned into we know as Uber and Lyft and many other alternatives. So in many ways, I think innovative business models come from new and many times disruptive technology.
Yeah, I think on John's point that there are going to be many opportunities post-pandemic, I do agree with that. Again, of course, it's all contingent on government not getting in the way, which I don't think is something we should rely on. I think once government expands its power, it's not going to be the politicians in charge are not going to be too keen on giving up that power. But I do look forward to seeing, I think there are two areas that, there's the obvious one where I think we'll see innovation, which is the workspace. You're not going to see people crammed into a small space together. People are going to be, working from home. I think many will be permanently working from home, even when this is all over. I think John was also talking about unsatisfied customers. I'm really hopeful that now that kids were studying at home and parents had a closer look at how they're being educated, certainly through the government system, I really hope those parents will be unsatisfied customers, and then we'll see innovation in that field that will be more be better than what government offers at the moment. But yeah, the great thing about what people come up with when they are left free is that we can't actually predict that. Nobody predicted this, and and we all love it. And I look forward to seeing what's going to happen, but I also hope that it's not going to be prevented by government.
Thank you. Well, we're running towards the end of our event here. We still have some time to address a couple of questions. One of them is, I think we shall best ask John about it, because it is related to the evolution of a disruptive innovation. Well, we call it disruptive once it has proven itself, and once it has, so to speak, gained its right to exist, and it has provided all the changes which it does. But how an entrepreneur would know when they come across such a innovation that this thing may actually disrupt, in a positive sense of the word, of course, the existing value chains, the existing networks which support the economic activity, and actually be a significant improvement. And that's why it is disruptive here, because it will totally change the way we work. So John, from your experience, as you're the entitled venture capitalist in our panel here, how do you know? Is it a gut feeling that you have when you come across such an idea and you reshape it in your mind to know that this would be a disruptive innovation, and it will break through despite its difficulties in the beginning to take over existing technologies, replace them, and at the end create a new market for a new product?
Well, the first thing I listen for when I'm talking to a entrepreneur who is seeking funding is a real unsatisfied customer need. And if I don't hear that, it's really hard for me to get excited about whatever they're working on. I remember one conversation, I relate this in my book, that I had with two entrepreneurs who told me about their new technology, which was browser-based and interactive and facilitated and online, facilitated communication. But we couldn't figure out a real customer need that it satisfied. And we talked about it for 20 or 30 minutes, going back and forth, and we finally figured out together that it could perhaps be used to facilitate communications among members of a distributed work group. Okay, well, that is a real need, but there are already well-established solutions out there that do that, like Slack and Salesforce and others nowadays. And so that would really be an uphill battle. Now, if there were a way that they could add value on top of the existing well-established players, that would be good. Or if they were sufficiently different in some way so that they satisfied the need differently, or a different need, not precisely the same need as Slack did and the other tools did, then that could be an opening. I like to say I started my first company with a really cool technology for which there was no market need. And it took me 6 to 9 months to let go of that idea and swap it for something for which there was a real market need, namely the ability to do surveys on the internet. This was back in the early 90s. And that product became a hit, Decisive Survey, and that's the product that's part of Google now. So it really does work. Start with the real customer need. And that way, you'll know that you're really addressing a customer need. This is counterintuitive for many people, and especially entrepreneurs especially engineers like me. We engineers, and I'm an electrical engineer and computer science guy, so easily get enamored with a cool technology. But it's quite possible that satisfying the need doesn't even require the technology. Maybe there's an easier way to do it. If so, that's okay. That's good. That's one less thing you have to worry about. So anyway, those are some thoughts. I generally wouldn't advise entrepreneurs to worry about being disruptive. Often the disruption doesn't come until you scale up. You have to start somewhere. You have to plant a seed, get it to grow, and at some point, after it reaches a certain size, then you can worry about such things as automating and streamlining and really scaling up. But it's very hard to do that without that initial seedling. So I would focus on the seedling first. Not all seedlings grow into large enterprises. Most of them don't, in fact. Most of them die off. But every large enterprise starts from a seedling.
Thank you, John. Thank you for this, for sharing with us your valuable experience. I hope we still have time for one last question to discuss among all of us. And it is again related to what we can expect from the post-pandemic world once we get there, if we ever get there. And it relates to sustainability. And this sustainability, the question comes from the floor, would be both social and ecological, and would economic goals be less short-sighted as they may have been perceived to be before the pandemic in many industrial sectors? We cannot help but think of ideas which relate to, especially in continental Europe, relate to the concept of degrowth, that is presumably more sustainable, eco-friendly, socially fair way of creating wealth, of generating value for all, and of course distributing or redistributing this value among members of society, but without necessarily focusing on the rate of growth of metrics like the GDP or return on capital. So do you think that this pandemic is disruptive to our entire capitalist way of doing things, of thinking, of organizing our efforts, both in a positive and sometimes in a negative sense of the word?
Well, I think it's an opportunity for opponents of capitalism, which they've taken completely and are successful in doing what they're doing. And I do think if it's an opportunity for advocates of capitalism and a free market, it's a long-term opportunity. This is not a battle that we can win quickly, but this is an opportunity to point to sort of the end goal. I think on the point of sustainability, what we're living through now with planes grounded and people not leaving home is the environmentalist dream. And I think we see that it's a nightmare. And hopefully this is something that we can take advantage of and say, listen, let's as humans think about humans first. And as I've said before, this is also what environmentalists actually do in practice. Individual environmentalists live their life. They don't follow their own advice. So I think we should work on tying those ideas, which people think are kind of divorced from reality, tying them to reality and saying, look, if you have an ideology that you cannot apply, reconsider that ideology and maybe find something better.
Federico, your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. This is a topic that I let's say I like to say in a way. I think, it's very telling. The same way that Neil Ferguson was caught violating his own quarantine, it's also very telling that the idea of degrowth comes from Europe. Europe, unfortunately, is particularly the European Union, is a continent that is basically an empire to the inside and a fortress to the outside. And this really says a lot because of you know, when you come from places that are not as fortunate as Europe, the degrowth policy, or it's almost a joke. I mean, it's a very bad joke. And on the other hand, we are living in a magnificent world in which many people, thanks basically to capitalism, are being lifted from poverty into middle class and into wealth. This process should not be stopped. I know there are certain, let's say, challenges regarding the environment. I am sure they are way better than the climate Scientologists claim. In fact, I mean, according to them, the world should have ended like 17 times already. So there are a lot to be optimistic. Of course, there are lots of things to improve. As Razi mentioned very properly, we are living in Greta Thunberg's world. I don't think, I mean, I am not very happy, and I suppose most of people are not very, very happy being locked in and not being able to do anything. And we should deal with the issues that we have in a more proper manner, using innovation, unleashing the creativity of individuals, of people who can bring new solutions to problems. That's how we solve this issue. So the degrowth, let's say, policy, I think it's borderline insane.
John, some final words from you as well?
You know, one of the key lessons of the pandemic is that I don't hear people talking about, at least I think it's a key lesson. And that is, and I know this sounds hopelessly old-fashioned, but the importance of saving something for a rainy day. Right now, it's raining. Right now, we can't do business to the full extent as we'd like to, and depending upon jurisdiction, things are either partially shut down or fully shut down or what have you. And even without the shutdown, it would still be difficult. I'm pretty sure even without the government-imposed shutdowns, and I don't call them lockdowns, I call them government-imposed shutdowns. Even without them, there'd be some amount of organic cooperation and behavioral changes that would emerge with people social distancing voluntarily. In any event, when there's a pandemic, it's hard to make a living, and it just shows that it's important for us to save something. Those people who have resources, extra resources, that they set aside in good times are doing very well right now. Stocks are really cheap. They can buy up assets at a low cost. So think about that, all of the members of the audience out there. Let this be a lesson. If you're early on in your career and life, realize that occasions like this will arise. And if you set some resources aside so that you can take advantage of a downturn in the economy like this, you'll be able to survive and thrive better than you would otherwise, and you won't be dependent on the government. And if the whole society had that mindset, none of us would be dependent on the government, and it would be impossible to enslave us in the ways that Federico was talking about.
Well, thank you, and thank you all three of you for participating and sharing with us your thoughts and your ideas. Obviously, this unexpected event, this stochastic shock, took us somehow by surprise and shook us probably to the bone. Of course, it depends on us now to find the best way to move forward. I join you in all those concerns we have expressed here, concerns about this growing role and place of governments across different countries, regardless of the region. This is something that we really have to stand up against, as I do believe it constitutes a threat to our liberal democracies and our understanding of what are the fundamental principles of our societies. I want to thank, of course, once again, the Austrian Economic Center, the Free Market Roadshow, for cooperating with the American University in Bulgaria and making this event available to all of our students and our audience. I want to thank once again Dean Robert White and our fresh alumnus Luka Gotsiridze, who is still on campus, and I hope that life on campus is not as sad as we're afraid it may be. Keep up your high spirits, and congratulations to the class of 2020 for graduating despite those difficult times. Everybody stay safe, take good care, be healthy, and thank you very, very much for your attention and for your interest in these events. The ideas of freedom will always be challenged, but they will never be defeated. Thank you very much to all of you, and hope to see you very, very soon. Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.